Fire, fire, danger, danger. Welcome back to another epic prehistoric showdown that will absolutely blow your mind. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most intense survival battles in Earth's ancient history. We're talking about a time when our early human ancestors faced off against one of the most terrifying predators that ever slithered across this planet. Picture this. 60 million years ago, the world was a completely different place. Massive swamps stretched across continents. Steaming jungles covered the land, and the air was thick with humidity and the sounds of creatures that would make your worst nightmares seem like bedtime stories. This was the Paleocene epoch, a time when life was recovering from the great extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs, and new apex predators were rising to claim their throne. But here's where things get absolutely insane. Our prehistoric human ancestors, primitive as they were, found themselves sharing this hostile world with a serpent so massive, so deadly, that it could swallow a modern crocodile whole without breaking a sweat. I'm talking about Titanoboa, the undisputed king of the ancient swamplands. Now, before we dive into this epic battle for survival, let me paint you a picture of just how brutal this world really was. The Earth's climate was scorching hot, with temperatures reaching levels that would cook most modern life forms alive. Massive rivers snaked through endless wetlands, creating the perfect hunting grounds for aquatic predators. The air was so thick with moisture that every breath felt like drowning, and the constant sound of dripping water echoed through towering cypress trees that stretched toward a sun that never seemed to set. In this hellish paradise, our early human ancestors were struggling to survive with nothing but stone tools, primitive fire, and their wits. They were small, vulnerable, and completely outmatched by the monstrous creatures that ruled this primordial world. But what they lacked in size and strength, they made up for in intelligence, adaptability, and an unbreakable will to survive. Enter Titanoboa, a serpent so massive that it defies imagination. Picture a snake longer than a school bus, weighing as much as a small car, with a body thick enough to crush the life out of anything foolish enough to cross its path. This wasn't just any snake. This was nature's perfect killing machine, evolved to dominate the warm, wet world of the Paleocene swamps. Titanoboa could grow up to 50 feet in length and weigh over 2,000 pounds of pure muscle and predatory instinct. Its jaw could unhinge wide enough to swallow prey the size of large mammals, and its constricting power was strong enough to crush the bones of creatures 3 times larger than early humans. When this monster moved through the water, it created waves that could be felt from hundreds of feet away. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. Despite being completely outmatched, our prehistoric ancestors didn't just survive in this world. They thrived. They developed hunting strategies, created weapons, built shelters, and formed communities that could stand against even the most terrifying predators. This wasn't just about survival. This was about proving that intelligence and cooperation could triumph over raw power and size. The swamp lands of the Paleocene were like a massive arena where life and death battles played out every single day. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that stepping outside your primitive shelter could mean facing a predator capable of ending your existence in seconds. The constant tension, the need to be alert every moment of every day, the understanding that one wrong move could mean death, not just for you, but for your entire family. Our early human ancestors lived in small groups, constantly moving through the treacherous swamplands in search of food, water, and safe places to rest. They had learned to read the signs of the wetlands, to understand when Titanoboa was near, and to use the environment to their advantage. They knew which trees could support their weight during a hasty escape, which waterways were safe to cross, and which areas to avoid completely. The psychological warfare alone was enough to drive most creatures insane. Imagine the stress of knowing that at any moment the water around you could explode into motion as 40 feet of pure predator launched itself at you with lightning speed. The humans had to develop an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, learning to detect the slightest ripples in the water, the faintest sounds in the undergrowth, and the subtle changes in the behavior of other animals that could signal the presence of the great serpent. But Titanoboa wasn't just a mindless killing machine. This apex predator was intelligent, patient, and incredibly strategic in its hunting methods. It could remain perfectly still for hours, submerged in murky water, with only its eyes and nostrils above the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When prey came within range, Titanoboa could explode from the water with the speed that seemed impossible for such a massive creature. The snake's hunting strategy was terrifyingly effective. It would position itself along known travel routes near water sources where animals had to drink, or in narrow passages between patches of dry land. Once it had selected its ambush point, Titanoboa would settle in and wait with the patience of a true apex predator. Hours could pass, even days, but the great serpent would remain motionless, conserving energy for the explosive burst of violence that would end its victim's life. Our prehistoric ancestors quickly learned to recognize these danger zones, but avoiding them entirely was impossible. The swamplands offered limited safe passage, and the humans needed access to the same resources that attracted Titanoboa's prey. This created an ongoing game of deadly chess, where both predator and prey had to constantly adapt their strategies to survive. The humans developed ingenious methods for detecting the presence of the great serpent. They learned to watch for the behavior of birds, which would fall silent when Titanoboa was near. They observed how fish would suddenly disappear from certain areas, and how the normal sounds of the swamp would change when the apex predator was hunting. These early warning systems were the difference between life and death in the prehistoric wetlands. When direct confrontation was unavoidable, our ancestors had to rely on tactics that would seem impossible to modern humans. They used fire as both a weapon and a deterrent, creating burning barriers that even Titanoboa would hesitate to cross. They developed spear techniques specifically designed to target the snake's vulnerable spots, and they learned to work together in coordinated attacks that could confuse and overwhelm even this massive predator. The weapons they created were marvels of primitive engineering. Sharpened stakes, hardened in fire, weighted throwing spears designed for maximum penetration, and ingenious trap systems that could wound or slow down the great serpent. Every tool was crafted with the understanding that their lives depended on its effectiveness against the ultimate predator. But perhaps most importantly, these early humans developed a deep understanding of Titanoboa's behavior patterns. They learned when the great serpent was most active, which environmental conditions made it more aggressive, and how its hunting strategies changed with the seasons. This knowledge became the foundation of their survival tactics, passed down through generations as a matter of life and death. The swamp wars between humans and Titanoboa weren't just isolated incidents. They were an ongoing struggle that shaped the evolution of human intelligence, cooperation, and survival instincts. Every encounter was a test that separated the quick from the dead, the clever from the foolish, and the united from the isolated. As we prepare to dive deeper into the most intense battles of this prehistoric war, remember that what you're about to witness represents the ultimate test of human ingenuity against nature's most perfect predator. The stakes couldn't be higher, the odds couldn't be worse, and the outcome will determine whether our species survives to see another day in this hostile world. The tension in these ancient battlegrounds was absolutely electric. Every single day brought new challenges that would test the limits of human endurance and creativity. But what happened next in this prehistoric war zone will completely change how you think about our early ancestors and their incredible ability to adapt under impossible pressure. Picture this scenario. A small band of early humans, maybe 15 individuals, including children and elders, had been tracking through the swamplands for 3 days straight. Their food supplies were running dangerously low, and they desperately needed to reach a known fishing spot where they could replenish their resources. But between them and survival lay a stretch of wetland that had become the hunting territory of not just one, but potentially multiple Titanoboa specimens. The group leader, a weathered survivor who had already faced the great serpent twice and lived to tell about it, knew that conventional travel routes would be suicide. The main waterways were too obvious, too predictable, and too perfectly suited for Titanoboa ambush tactics. Instead, he made a decision that would either save his people or doom them all. They would travel at night. Now, you might think this sounds completely insane, and honestly, it was. Moving through treacherous swampland in complete darkness, where a single wrong step could mean falling into water, inhabited by the most dangerous predator on the planet. But our prehistoric ancestors understood something that most people today have forgotten. Sometimes the most dangerous option is actually the safest choice. Titanoboa, despite being an incredible hunter, relied heavily on visual detection and the vibrations created by prey moving through water during daylight hours. At night, the great serpent's hunting patterns shifted dramatically. It became more cautious, more conservative, spending longer periods completely motionless to avoid detection by its own predators and competitors. The human group prepared for their midnight journey with meticulous planning that would impress modern military strategists. They created makeshift torches, that could be quickly extinguished if danger approached. They developed a silent communication system using hand signals that worked even in near total darkness. Most importantly, they assigned specific roles to each member of the group, ensuring that everyone knew exactly what to do if they encountered the enemy. The youngest and most agile members served as scouts, moving ahead of the main group to test the safety of each section of their route. The strongest fighters stayed in the middle, ready to form a protective barrier around the children and elders at the first sign of danger. The most experienced survivors brought up the rear, watching for signs of pursuit and ready to create distractions if the group needed to scatter. As they began their treacherous journey through the moonlit swampland, every step was calculated, every breath controlled, every movement designed to minimize their detection by the apex predator that could be lurking anywhere in the dark waters around them. The psychological pressure was unimaginable. Imagine trying to move silently through knee-deep water, knowing that the slightest splash could attract the attention of a creature capable of ending your life in seconds. But here's where the story gets absolutely incredible. About halfway through their journey, disaster struck in the worst possible way. One of the scouts, a young male who had been moving ahead of the group, suddenly froze in terror. Through the darkness, he had spotted the unmistakable silhouette of Titanoboa coiled and waiting in the exact path they needed to take. The great serpent was positioned perfectly to block their route to safety. Its massive body stretched across the narrow passage between two patches of solid ground, creating an impassable barrier of muscle and death. Turning back wasn't an option because they had already committed too much time and energy to this dangerous crossing. Going around would add hours to their journey and force them to travel in daylight, when Titanoboa would have every advantage. This was the moment that would define whether these early humans were truly capable of outwitting nature's most perfect predator. The group leader faced an impossible decision: attack a creature 10 times their size with primitive weapons, attempt a desperate flanking maneuver through even more dangerous terrain, or try to wait out the serpent and hope it would move on before dawn exposed them to even greater dangers. What happened next showcases the incredible problem-solving abilities that would eventually allow our species to dominate the planet. Instead of choosing any of the obvious options, the humans developed a strategy so clever, so unexpected, that it caught even the most experienced predator completely off guard. They decided to use Titanoboa's own hunting instincts against it. The group split into 2 teams with radically different objectives. The first team, consisting of the 3 most experienced hunters, would create a deliberate distraction designed to trigger Titanoboa's predatory response. The second team, including all the non-combatants and 2 additional fighters, would use the confusion to slip past the great serpent, using a route that should have been impossible to navigate safely. The distraction team moved to a position roughly 50 yards away from Titanoboa's ambush point. Using techniques they had developed through years of dangerous encounters, they began creating the sounds and movements that would mimic wounded prey struggling in the water. They splashed carefully, making noise patterns that suggested an animal in distress, but not so much that it would seem like an obvious trap. The psychological warfare was intense. These three humans were deliberately making themselves bait for the most dangerous predator on Earth, trusting their lives to their ability to read the serpent's behavior and react faster than its lightning-quick strike. One miscalculation, one moment of hesitation, and they would become Titanoboa's next meal. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the great serpent remained motionless, evaluating the sounds and deciding whether to investigate. The humans could see its massive head turning slightly, testing the air with its forked tongue, processing chemical signals that would help it determine whether this disturbance represented a genuine hunting opportunity or a potential threat. Then, with explosive violence that sent shock waves through the water, Titanoboa launched itself toward the source of the distraction. The serpent moved with terrifying speed, its massive body creating waves that could be felt from hundreds of feet away. But the humans were ready. The moment Titanoboa committed to its attack, the distraction team scattered in three different directions, each taking a predetermined escape route that led away from the main group's position. The serpent, confused by multiple targets moving in different directions, had to choose which prey to pursue. This split second of indecision was exactly what the humans had counted on. Meanwhile, the second team was executing the most dangerous part of their plan. While Titanoboa was focused on the distraction, they were moving through water that was barely 2 feet deep, crossing the exact area where the great serpent had been lying in wait just moments before. They had to move quickly but silently, covering exposed ground while the predator was distracted, knowing that if it returned before they reached safety, they would be trapped in the open with nowhere to hide. The tension was absolutely unbearable. Children who were simultaneously trying to move fast were being carried by adults while remaining quiet enough to avoid a tract enough to escape detectioning attention. Every ripple in the water could potentially alert Titanoboa to their presence. Every sound from the darkness could signal that their distraction had failed and the great serpent was returning to its original position. But the plan worked with precision that would make modern special forces teams jealous. The distraction team successfully led Titanoboa away from the crossing point, using their knowledge of the swampland terrain to stay just ahead of the pursuing predator. They led it through a series of obstacles and confusing waterways that gradually wore down its pursuit instincts and convinced it that the hunt wasn't worth the energy expenditure. The main group completed their crossing and reached the safety of solid ground, just as the first hints of dawn began to appear on the horizon. They had successfully outmaneuvered the most dangerous predator in their world, using nothing but intelligence, cooperation, and an intimate understanding of their enemy's behavior patterns. This incredible victory represented more than just survival. It demonstrated that early humans were developing the strategic thinking and group coordination skills that would eventually allow our species to thrive in even the most hostile environments. Strength and individual hero. They were learning that raw wits weren't enough to survive in a world dominated by apex predators. Success required teamwork, planning, and the ability to think several moves ahead of their enemies. The psychological impact of this victory rippled through the entire group. They had faced their worst nightmare and emerged victorious through clever tactics rather than brute force. This experience would be passed down through generations, becoming part of the survival knowledge that helped early humans navigate an impossibly dangerous world. But Titanoboa wasn't finished with them. The great serpent had been outmaneuvered this time. But apex predators don't achieve their status by giving up after a single failed hunt. The war between these early humans and the king of the ancient swamplands was far from over, and the next encounter would test their survival skills in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The victory was intoxicating, but our prehistoric ancestors knew better than to celebrate too early. In the ancient swamplands, overconfidence was a death sentence that countless creatures had already paid in full. The group pressed forward through the pre-dawn darkness, every sense heightened by the knowledge that they had just declared war on the most lethal predator their world had ever produced. What was that Titanoboa possessed? They didn't realize something that would make their next encounter infinitely more terrifying than anything they had faced before. Memory. The great serpent wasn't just a mindless killing machine driven by instinct alone. It was a learning predator, capable of adapting its hunting strategies based on previous experiences. And their clever escape had just taught it something incredibly dangerous about human behavior patterns. 3 weeks passed without incident, lulling the group into a false sense of security. They had successfully established a temporary camp. Near the rich fishing grounds they had risked everything to reach. Food was plentiful, the children were growing stronger, and the constant stress of survival had eased just term planning, rather than moment enough to allow them to focus on long-to-moment terror. But Titanoboa was planning too. The great serpent had spent those 3 weeks systematically studying human movement patterns throughout the region. It observed their fishing techniques, their water collection routines, and, most importantly, their escape routes. Where humans saw random waterways and confusing terrain, Titanoboa saw a predictable network of paths that could be manipulated to create the perfect trap. The serpent's intelligence was truly frightening. It understood that humans were social creatures who would risk everything to save their companions. It recognized that their greatest strength, their ability to work together, could be turned into their greatest weakness with the right application of psychological pressure. And it was about to demonstrate just how terrifyingly effective a patient, learning predator could be. The trap began to unfold on what started as a perfectly ordinary morning. 2 of the group's most experienced fishermen, brothers who had been working these waters for over a decade, set out before dawn to check their nets in a secluded cove about half a mile from the main camp. It was a routine they had performed hundreds of times, moving through familiar territory with the confidence that comes from years of successful repetition. They never made it to their destination. When the brothers failed to return by midday, the group leader organized a search party consisting of their 4 best trackers. These weren't inexperienced scouts. They were hardened survivors who could read signs in the swampland like others read written language. They could identify the age of footprints in mud, determine the direction and speed of travel from disturbed vegetation, and detect the presence of predators from the subtlest environmental changes. What they found defied everything they thought they knew about behavior. The brothers Titanoboa's hunting trail was easy to follow initially. Their footprints led along the established path toward the fishing cove, showing normal walking patterns with no signs of distress or urgency. But approximately halfway to their destination, something extraordinary had happened. The tracks suddenly changed direction, veering off the safe route into a section of swampland that no experienced traveler would enter voluntarily. The trackers followed the new trail with growing confusion and mounting dread. The footprints showed that the brothers had been moving quickly, almost running, but there were no signs of pursuit, no predator tracks, no disturbed vegetation indicating a chase, no evidence of the violent struggle that should have accompanied an attack by Titanoboa or predator. Then any other large, they found the first body. The older brother was discovered in a small clearing, positioned in a way that immediately told the experienced trackers that something was terror-spread wide, with Ibley wrong. He was lying on his back, arms no visible injuries except for the telltale signs of constriction around his torso. But what made the scene truly horrifying was its obvious artificiality. The body had been deliberately placed, arranged to be easily discovered by anyone following the trail. This wasn't a kill site. It was bait. The younger brother was nowhere to be found, but his trail continued deeper into increasingly dangerous terrain. The trackers realized they were being led into the heart of Titanoboa's territory, guided by a predator that understood human psychology well enough to know they would never abandon their search for a missing companion. The great serpent was using their own loyalty and determination against them. But understanding the trap didn't make it any easier to avoid. The missing brother could still be alive, possibly wounded, and unable to escape on his own. Abandoning the search would mean accepting his death without knowing for certain whether he could have been saved. For the tight-knit group that together this was and had survived so much impossible choice. The lead tracker made a decision that demonstrated the incredible courage that had allowed humans to survive in this hostile world. He would continue following the trail alone, moving fast and light, while the other 3 returned to camp to warn the group and prepare for whatever was coming next. It was a suicide mission disguised as reconnaissance, and everyone knew it. What happened next showcased Titanoboa's evolution into something far more dangerous than a simple apex predator. The great serpent had become a strategic hunter, capable of complex planning that stretched across multiple days and involved psychological manipulation that would be impressive even by modern standards. The lone tracker followed the trail deeper into the swampland, his every instinct screaming warnings that he forced himself to ignore. The path led through increasingly narrow passages between towering cypress trees, across waterways that were perfect for ambushes, and into terrain that offered virtually no escape routes. It was a master class in predator psychology, designed to gradually increase stress and fear until the prey made a fatal mistake. But our prehistoric ancestors had learned to think like predators themselves. The tracker recognized the psychological warfare being waged against him and developed countermeasures that demonstrated himself to move remarkable mental toughness. He fought slowly and deliberately, fighting against the urgent need to rush toward his potentially dying companion. He took time to study each section of the trail, looking for signs that would reveal Titanoboa's actual position rather than simply following where the serpent wanted him to go. The breakthrough came when he noticed something that changed everything about their understanding of the enemy they faced. The younger brother's footprints showed subtle changes that indicated he wasn't just being chased, he was being herded. Titanoboa had been guiding both brothers from the very beginning, using carefully timed appearances and strategic positioning to drive them away from safety and into the perfect killing ground. This level of behavioral manipulation was beyond anything the humans had previously encountered. They were facing a predator that could plan complex operations involving multiple stages, psychological pressure, and long-term strategic thinking. Titanoboa wasn't just hunting them. It was conducting warfare using tactics that required intelligence, patience, and a deep understanding of human behavior patterns. The tracker realized he was walking into the final stage of an elaborate trap that had been weeks in the making. But he also understood that he now possessed information that could save not just his own life, but potentially the lives of everyone in his group. Titanoboa's new hunting strategy, while terrifyingly effective, also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by humans who understood what they were really facing. He began moving differently, no longer following the obvious trail, but instead using his knowledge of swampland terrain to approach the probable ambush site from an unexpected direction. If the younger brother was still alive, and if Titanoboa was indeed waiting in a predetermined kill zone, then there might still be a chance to against it. The final turn, the predator's own strategy confrontation, was building toward a climax that would test everything these early humans had learned about survival, strategy, and the incredible power of intelligence over raw, physical dominance. But what the tracker discovered in that remote killing ground would change their understanding of Titanoboa forever and force them to completely reimagine their approach to surviving in a world where the apex predator was learning to hunt like a human. Meanwhile, back at the main camp, the returning trackers were organizing a response that would either represent the pinnacle of human tactical evolution or the beginning of their complete annihilation. They understood that Titanoboa had declared total war on their group and that conventional survival strategies would no longer be sufficient existence. The group, to ensure their continued leader, gathered every adult for a council that would determine their fate. They could abandon their hard-won territory and flee deeper into the swamplands, hoping to find refuge in areas where Titanoboa hadn't yet established dominance. They could attempt to kill the great serpent using coordinated attacks that would require perfect execution and would likely cost several lives even if successful. Or they could try something that had never been attempted before in the history of human-predator conflict. They could try to communicate with their enemy. The idea seemed insane, but it was based on a growing understanding that Titanoboa's behavior had evolved beyond simple predatory instinct. The great serpent was demonstrating problem-solving abilities, long-term planning, and psychological manipulation that suggested a level of intelligence that might be capable of wreaking benefit in coercing mutual existence rather than total warfare. But first, they had to survive the immediate crisis and rescue their missing companions, if any hope remained. The plan they developed would require splitting their already small group, coordinating complex timing across multiple locations, and executing maneuvers that had never been tested against a predator of Titanoboa's intelligence and capabilities. The stakes couldn't be higher, the odds couldn't be worse, and the next few hours would determine whether early humans possessed the tactical brilliance necessary to survive against an enemy that was learning to hunt like them. The tension reached a breaking point as the group prepared for what could be their final stand against the apex predator that had turned hunting into an art form. Every member of the community next few hours would either understood that they established them as true masters of survival or mark the end of their blue acherous swamplands. Deadline in these tree rescue operation they designed was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in prehistoric warfare. Instead of the traditional approach of overwhelming force or desperate flight, they chose to fight intelligence with intelligence, using Titanoboa's own tactical brilliance against itself of deadly chess in a game where every move could result in immediate death. 3 separate teams would coordinate their movements across the dangerous terrain, each with specific objectives that had to be completed with perfect timing. The first team, consisting of 2 of their most agile scouts, would approach the suspected ambush site from the north, creating controlled disturbances designed to test Titanoboa's positioning without triggering a full attack response. Their job was pure reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about the serpent's exact location and behavioral state. The second team, made up of their 4 strongest fighters armed with the deadliest weapons they could craft, would establish a perimeter around the kill zone from the east and west. These weren't traditional spear throwers or club wielders, but tactical specialists who had developed combat techniques specifically designed for fighting creatures many times their size. They carried fire-hardened stakes that could penetrate even the toughest scales, weighted nets that could temporarily entangle even massive predators, and most importantly, burning torches that could create walls of flame to control Titanoboa's movement by the group's most experienced tracker options. The third team, Halle, was already deep in enemy territory, would attempt the actual rescue operation from the south. This was the most dangerous assignment, requiring them to locate and extract any distracted by the activity's survivors, while Titanoboa was of the other teams. They would have only minutes to complete their mission before the great serpent realized it was facing a coordinated attack rather than random prey animals stumbling into its domain. The psychological pressure on every team member was absolutely crushing. They were voluntarily entering combat against a predator that had never been successfully challenged by humans, using tactics that existed only in theory, with no backup plan if their strategy failed. One mistake, one moment of hesitation or poor communication, and the entire group could be wiped out in a matter of minutes. But these early humans had learned something that modern people often forget. Sometimes the most dangerous situations require the most audacious solutions. Playing it safe against an enemy like Titanoboa meant slow, inevitable defeat. Their only chance for survival lay in taking risks that would seem completely insane to anyone who hadn't spent years fighting for their lives in the prehistoric wilderness. The operation began at dawn, when the morning mist provided natural camouflage and Titanoboa would be transitioning from its nocturnal hunting patterns to its daytime behavior. The Northern Reconnaissance Team moved first, carefully approaching the suspected ambush zone while maintaining constant awareness of escape routes and emergency signals. What they discovered exceeded their worst fears and confirmed their growing understanding of just how dangerous their enemy had become. Titanoboa hadn't simply set up a single ambush point. It had created an entire kill zone covering nearly an acre of swampland. The great serpent had somehow manipulated the terrain itself, using its massive body to alter water flow patterns and create channels that would funnel prey toward multiple predetermined strike positions. The younger brother was indeed still alive, but his situation was far more complex than a simple kidnapping scenario. He had been positioned in the center of the kill zone, conscious but unable to move due to injuries that appeared to be deliberately inflicted to prevent escape without causing immediate death. Titanoboa was using him as both bait and psychological warfare, knowing that the rescue attempt would force the humans to enter the most dangerous possible terrain under the worst possible tactical conditions. The reconnaissance team transmitted their findings using the silent communication system they had developed, sending detailed intelligence about Titanoboa's position, the layout of the kill zone, and the condition of their trapped companion. The information was both encouraging and terrifying. The rescue was possible, but it would require perfect execution of a plan that had never been tested under real combat conditions. The eastern and western perimeter teams moved into position, establishing fire points that could create barriers to control Titanoboa's movement options during the rescue attempt. They had learned from previous encounters that the great serpent, despite its incredible size and power, showed instinctive caution around large fires. This wasn't fear in the human sense, but rather the practical caution of a predator that understood the difference between manageable risks and potentially fatal hazards. The fighters positioned themselves at key choke points around the kill zone, ready to create walls of flame that would force Titanoboa to choose specific attack routes that the humans could predict and counter. This required incredible courage, as they were essentially volunteering to serve as primary targets for a creature that could crush them to death in seconds. The Southern Extraction Team, led by their most experienced survivor, began the most dangerous part of the operation. They had to cross nearly 200 yards of open water and treacherous terrain to reach the trapped brother, complete the rescue, and escape before Titanoboa could respond with overwhelming force. The margin for error was essentially zero. As they began their approach, every team member understood that they were participating in something that would be remembered for generations, assuming anyone survived to tell the story. This wasn't just a rescue operation. It was a declaration that humans would no longer accept the role of helpless prey in their own world. They were challenging the natural order itself, using millions of years perfecting the extraction, intelligence, and cooperation to overcome advantages that evolution had spent. Team moved through the swampland with precision that would have impressed modern special forces operators. They used natural cover, controlled their breathing to minimize sound, and communicated through hand signals that could convey complex tactical information without alerting their enemy. Every step was calculated to minimize their detection while maintaining the speed necessary to complete their mission before Titanoboa could mount an effective response. But the great serpent was ready for them. As the rescue team reached the halfway point of their approach, Titanoboa revealed the true scope of its strategic planning. The trapped brother hadn't just been positioned as bait. He had been placed at the center of a carefully designed tactical scenario that would force the humans to expose themselves in ways that maximize the serpent's advantages while minimizing their own. The moment the extraction team committed to crossing the final stretch of open ground, Titanoboa launched a coordinated counterattack that demonstrated intelligence levels that bordered on the supernatural. Instead of the expected frontal assault, the great serpent attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, using its incredible length to strike at different teams while maintaining defensive positions that protected its most vulnerable areas. The perimeter teams found themselves under assault from directions they hadn't anticipated, forcing them to abandon their carefully planned fire barriers and fight for their lives, using weapons and tactics designed for entirely different combat scenarios. The reconnaissance team discovered that their supposed safe positions were actually part of Titanoboa's kill zone, and they had to execute emergency escapes through terrain that offered almost no cover from the serpent's lightning-fast strikes. The extraction team, caught in the open during the most dangerous part of their mission, faced a choice that would define the outcome of the entire operation. They could abort the rescue and try to escape with their lives, leaving their trapped companion to certain death, but preserving the fighting strength of their group. Or they could complete their mission despite the overwhelming tactical disadvantages, risking total annihilation in an attempt to save a single life. What happened next would demonstrate whether early humans possessed the moral courage and tactical brilliance necessary to survive against an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. The leader of the extraction team made a decision that would either represent the pinnacle of human heroism or the final act of a doomed species. Instead of retreating or pushing forward with the original plan, he did something that no one including Titanoboa, had anticipated. He deliberately triggered a controlled collapse of their entire tactical structure, abandoning the carefully coordinated plan in favor of pure chaos that would force both predator and prey to rely on instinct and adaptability rather than strategic planning. The extraction team scattered in multiple directions, each member following predetermined chaos protocols that would create maximum confusion while maintaining the possibility of regrouping for a secondary rescue attempt. The perimeter teams abandoned their fire barriers and began creating random disturbances throughout the kill zone, turning the organized battlefield into a confusing maze of threats and opportunities that even Titanoboa couldn't predict or control. The reconnaissance team used the confusion to execute flanking maneuvers that brought them into positions where they could provide covering fire for the extraction attempt, using primitive projectile weapons that had been held in reserve for exactly this type of emergency situation. The psychological impact on Titanoboa was immediately apparent. The great serpent had prepared for coordinated human tactics, but it hadn't anticipated the deliberate abandonment of coordination in favor of controlled chaos. Its strategic planning, which had been its greatest advantage, became a liability when the battlefield situation changed faster than its intelligence could process and adapt. This was the moment when early humans proved that their greatest strength wasn't their ability to make plans, but their capacity to abandon those plans when circumstances demanded immediate adaptation. They demonstrated a flexibility of thinking that even the most intelligent predators couldn't match, showing that true intelligence isn't about following predetermined strategies, but about recognizing when those strategies need to be completely reimagined. The rescue operation transformed from a carefully orchestrated tactical engagement into a wild, desperate battle where both sides had to rely on raw courage, split-second decision-making, and the kind of adaptive thinking that separates true survivors from those who simply follow instructions. The outcome would depend not on who had the better plan, but on who could think faster and adapt more effectively when all plans fell apart. In the midst of this chaos, something extraordinary happened that would change the relationship between humans and apex predators forever. As the extraction team finally reached their trapped companion and began the process of getting him to safety, they discovered something that revolutionized their understanding of what they were really fighting. Titanoboa wasn't just hunting them for food or territorial dominance. The great serpent was studying them, learning from them, and evolving its own intelligence through direct combat with the most adaptable prey it had ever encountered. This wasn't just predation. It was a form of interspecies education, where both humans and serpent were pushing each other to develop new capabilities that neither species had possessed before their conflict began. The implications were staggering. They weren't just fighting for their lives, they were participating in an evolutionary arms race that was accelerating the development of intelligence, tactics, and survival strategies for both species. Every encounter made them smarter, more adaptable, and more dangerous. But it was also making Titanoboa more intelligent, more strategic, and more capable of anticipating human behavior. The war between humans and Titanoboa had become something unprecedented in natural history. It was no longer about simple survival, but about which species could evolve faster under the intense pressure of constant conflict. The stakes had escalated beyond individual lives or even group survival to encompass the future evolutionary trajectory of both species. As the rescue operation reached its climactic moment, with human and serpent locked in combat that would determine not just the immediate outcome, but the long-term balance of power in the ancient swamplands, both sides understood that they were fighting for something far more significant than temporary victory or defeat. They were fighting for the right to define what intelligence, adaptation, and survival would mean in a world where the traditional rules of predator and prey relationships no longer applied. The outcome of this battle would echo through evolutionary history, influencing the development of both species for generations to come. The final confrontation was building toward a resolution that neither side could fully predict or control, but both were determined to influence through every ounce of courage, intelligence, and adaptability they possessed. The chaos reached its absolute peak as both species pushed beyond every limit they had ever known. The extraction team, now carrying their wounded companion, found themselves trapped in a nightmare scenario where traditional escape routes had become death traps. And Titanoboa was demonstrating combat intelligence that defied everything they thought they knew about serpent behavior. But here's where the story takes an absolutely mind-blowing turn that will change everything you think you know about prehistoric survival. The wounded brother, who had been unconscious during most of his captivity, suddenly regained awareness at the worst possible moment. Instead of the relief you might expect, his awakening brought a revelation that sent shock waves through the entire rescue operation. He had been conscious for much longer than anyone realized. During his time as Titanoboa's prisoner, he had been observing the great serpent's behavior patterns, learning its hunting rhythms, and most incredibly, he had discovered something that would revolutionize their understanding of their enemy forever. Titanoboa wasn't acting alone. It was part of a coordinated network of apex predators that had been systematically studying human behavior across multiple territories. The implications hit the rescue team like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting one incredibly intelligent serpent. They were up against what amounted to a prehistoric intelligence network that spanned hundreds of miles of swampland territory. The coordination they had witnessed, the strategic planning, the psychological warfare, it was all part of a larger system where multiple Titanoboa specimens were sharing information and developing collective hunting strategies. This discovery transformed their immediate tactical situation from desperate to absolutely catastrophic. If other serpents were monitoring this battle, learning from Titanoboa's engagement with human tactics, then every strategy they had developed could potentially be countered by future encounters with different members of the network. They weren't just fighting for their lives in this moment. They were fighting to prevent their tactical knowledge from being distributed to every apex predator in the region. The wounded brother, despite his injuries, managed to communicate critical intelligence that changed everything about their escape strategy. During his captivity, he had observed subtle communication patterns between Titanoboa and what appeared to be at least two other massive serpents that had visited the kill zone during the previous days. The great serpents were using complex chemical signals, body positioning, and environmental manipulation to share tactical information across vast distances. This prehistoric intelligence network operated on principles that wouldn't look out of place in modern military strategy. Different serpents specialized in different aspects of human behavior analysis. Some focused on hunting pattern recognition, others specialized in psychological manipulation, and the most experienced specimens served as tactical coordinators that could direct complex multi-predator operations across enormous territories. The rescue team realized they were witnessing something that would fundamentally change the evolutionary trajectory of both species. This wasn't random predation or even sophisticated individual hunting behavior. This was the emergence of collective intelligence among apex predators, creating a threat level that individual human groups simply couldn't match using conventional survival strategies. But our prehistoric ancestors had something that even the most intelligent predator network couldn't replicate. They had imagination, the ability to conceive of possibilities that didn't exist in their immediate environment, to plan for scenarios they had never encountered, and to develop solutions that transcended the limitations of their physical capabilities. The leader of the extraction team made a decision that would either represent the most brilliant tactical innovation in human history or the final act of a doomed rescue mission. Instead of trying to escape from a Titanoboa's network, they would attempt to corrupt it. They would feed false information into the serpent communication system, using their understanding of predator psychology to introduce tactical confusion that could disrupt the entire network's effectiveness. The plan was audaciously complex and required perfect timing across multiple simultaneous actions. While half the team continued the extraction under covering fire from the perimeter units, the other half would deliberately expose themselves to Titanoboa's intelligence gathering, but they would do so while demonstrating fake tactical patterns designed to mislead future predator responses. They would essentially perform theater for an audience of learning predators, teaching them incorrect information about human capabilities, behavioral patterns, and tactical responses. If successful, this deception could provide their group with tactical advantages that would persist for months or even years, as the false information spread through the serpent network. The psychological pressure of executing this plan was beyond anything humans had ever attempted. They had to convincingly portray fake panic, simulate tactical mistakes, and demonstrate false capabilities while simultaneously conducting a real rescue operation under combat conditions. One slip in their performance, one moment where their real tactics showed through the deception, and the entire strategy would backfire catastrophically. But the alternative was accepting that their species would be systematically hunted to extinction by an intelligence network that was learning faster than individual human groups could adapt. This was their chance to level the playing field by turning the predator's greatest strength into a vulnerability that could be exploited. The deception team began their performance with acting skills that would have impressed professional entertainers. They simulated communication breakdowns, demonstrated fake weapon limitations, and portrayed tactical confusion that suggested human intelligence was far more limited than it actually was. Meanwhile, their real tactical capabilities remained hidden, disguised as accidents or desperate improvisation rather than deliberate strategy. Titanoboa responded exactly as they had hoped, adjusting its attack patterns to counter the fake human limitations while remaining vulnerable to their real capabilities. The Great Serpent's intelligence network was receiving and processing false information, incorporating incorrect assumptions about human behavior into its tactical database. The extraction itself became a masterpiece of coordinated deception and genuine tactical brilliance. As the wounded brother was being moved to safety, the covering teams maintained their fake tactical patterns while secretly establishing real defensive positions that could counter Titanoboa's actual attack strategies. They were fighting two battles simultaneously, one fake battle designed to mislead their enemy, and one real battle designed to ensure their survival. The perimeter teams created false fire barriers that appeared to be their primary defensive strategy, while secretly preparing backup positions with real weapons that could deliver devastating attacks if the serpent committed to assaulting the fake defenses. Every movement was choreographed to reinforce the deception while maintaining genuine tactical effectiveness. Titanoboa, despite its incredible intelligence, fell for aspects of the deception that aligned with its existing assumptions about human limitations. The Great Serpent had learned to counter human coordination, but it hadn't anticipated human capacity for deliberate misdirection on this scale. Its network intelligence, which had been its greatest advantage, became the vector through which false information could be introduced into its tactical database. The rescue operation reached its climax as the extraction team successfully retrieved their wounded companion and began moving toward the predetermined escape routes. But the real test of their deception strategy was yet to come. Would Titanoboa's network accept the false tactical information they had been fed? Or would the serpents recognize the deception and adapt their hunting strategies accordingly? The wounded brother, despite his injuries, provided crucial real-time intelligence about Titanoboa's behavioral responses during the extraction. He had learned to read the Great Serpent's body language during his captivity, and he could identify whether their deception was being accepted or recognized as false. His observations would determine whether they had achieved a tactical breakthrough or simply delayed their inevitable defeat. As they moved through the escape routes, the human teams maintained their deceptive performance while secretly monitoring Titanoboa's responses for signs that their strategy was working. The Great Serpent's attack patterns began showing subtle changes that suggested it was incorporating the false information into its tactical calculations, adjusting its strategies based on incorrect assumptions about human capabilities. The psychological warfare had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. Titanoboa's intelligence network was not only accepting the false information, but it was beginning to distribute it to other serpents in the region. The humans had successfully introduced a virus of misinformation into the predator communication system, potentially compromising the tactical effectiveness of the entire network. But victory came with a terrifying realization. If they could corrupt the serpent intelligence network with false information, then the serpents might eventually develop countermeasures that could detect and neutralize human deception tactics. The evolutionary arms race was accelerating again, pushing both species toward even higher levels of strategic sophistication. The escape itself became a running battle where human and serpent intelligence were being tested and refined through direct combat. Every tactical decision made by either side was being observed, analyzed, and incorporated into future strategic planning. The survivors of this encounter, both human and serpent, would carry tactical knowledge that could influence the outcome of conflicts for generations to come. As the human group finally reached relative safety, they realized they had fundamentally changed the nature of their relationship with the apex predators that dominated their world. They were no longer simply prey animals trying to avoid detection. They had become active participants in an intelligence war where victory would be determined by which species could evolve faster under the intense pressure of constant tactical innovation. The Wounded Brothers' intelligence about the Serpent communication network opened up possibilities for future operations that could have seemed like fantasy just hours earlier. If humans could systematically introduce false information into predator intelligence networks, they might be able to create safe corridors through dangerous territories, establish early warning systems for predator movements, and even coordinate multi-group operations across vast distances. But these opportunities came with risks that were equally staggering. If the serpents detected and adapted to human deception tactics, the predator intelligence network could become exponentially more dangerous than it had been before human interference. The stakes of every future encounter would be magnified by the knowledge that both species were actively trying to outthink and outmaneuver each other. The group established a temporary camp in a defensible position where they could treat the wounded brother's injuries and analyze the intelligence he had gathered during his captivity. His observations about serpent behavior, communication methods, and network coordination would become the foundation for developing new survival strategies that could protect not just their group, but potentially every human community in the region. The intelligence debriefing revealed details about Titanoboa's capabilities that were both encouraging and terrifying. The great serpents were indeed operating as a coordinated network, but their communication system had limitations that could potentially be exploited. They relied heavily on chemical signals that could be disrupted by environmental manipulation, and their tactical coordination decreased significantly over long distances. More importantly, the serpent network appeared to have difficulty processing information that contradicted their existing behavioral models. This suggested that humans could potentially introduce systematic deceptions that would be accepted and propagated throughout the network, creating tactical advantages that could persist for extended periods. But the wounded brother also reported observations that challenged every assumption they had made about predator intelligence. The serpents weren't just learning human tactics. They were beginning to experiment with modified versions of human strategies. Titanoboa had been observed using environmental manipulation techniques that appeared to be based on human engineering principles, suggesting that the intelligence exchange was flowing in both directions. The implications were staggering. The Serpent Intelligence Network wasn't just studying human behavior, it was actively incorporating human tactical innovations into its own strategic planning. The evolutionary arms race had reached a level where both species were directly learning from each other, accelerating their tactical development through combat-driven knowledge exchange. This revelation transformed their understanding of what they were really fighting for. It wasn't just about survival in the immediate sense, but about maintaining human tactical superiority in an intelligence war where the enemy was actively stealing and improving upon their innovations. Every successful human strategy would eventually be countered by serpent adaptations that incorporated the most effective elements while eliminating human advantages. The group faced a strategic decision that would influence the survival prospects of every human community in the region. They could share their intelligence about the Serpent Network with other groups, potentially creating a human intelligence network that could match the predator coordination they had discovered. But this would also risk exposing their tactical innovations to serpent observation, accelerating the enemy's ability to develop countermeasures. Alternatively, they could attempt to maintain tactical superiority through secrecy, keeping their knowledge within their own group while systematically disrupting serpent intelligence networks through targeted deception operations. This approach offered better security, but limited their ability to protect other human communities that lacked their tactical knowledge. The decision would define not just their own survival strategy, but the evolutionary trajectory of human tactical development in a world where apex predators were learning to think like humans, while humans were learning to hunt like predators. The war between intelligence and instinct had evolved into something unprecedented in natural history, where both sides were actively trying to steal and improve upon each other's innovations. As they prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, the group understood that their successful rescue operation had marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict between humans and Titanoboa. They had proven that human intelligence could outwit even the most sophisticated predator networks. But they had also revealed their capabilities to an enemy that was actively learning from every encounter. The ancient swamplands had become a testing ground for tactical innovations that would influence the development of both species for thousands of generations. Every battle was simultaneously a fight for immediate survival and a classroom where both predator and prey were developing new capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what intelligence could achieve in natural combat situations. The stage was set for conflicts that would test the absolute limits of both human and serpent tactical evolution, where victory would be determined not by physical strength or individual heroics, but by which species could think faster, adapt more effectively, and innovate more successfully under the ultimate pressure of life and death combat. The war was far from over, and both sides were preparing for battles that would make their previous encounters look like simple skirmishes in comparison to the sophisticated tactical warfare that was yet to come. The next phase of their survival strategy required something that had never been attempted in the history of human-predator conflict. They needed to create a permanent intelligence advantage that could protect not just their own group, but potentially reshape the entire balance of power in the ancient swamplands. The Wounded Brothers' revelations about the Serpent Communication Network had opened up possibilities that seemed almost magical in their potential scope and impact. But first, they had to solve an immediate problem that threatened to undo everything they had accomplished. The successful rescue operation had marked their group as a significant threat in the eyes of the Predator Network. Titanoboa and its allies would undoubtedly be developing new strategies specifically designed to counter human tactical innovations. They were now the hunted, targeted by intelligence that viewed them as dangerous enough to require specialized elimination protocols. The group leader convened an emergency council that would determine their long-term survival strategy. They could no longer rely on traditional approaches of avoidance and defensive positioning. Their successful intelligence warfare had escalated the conflict to a level where both sides would be actively seeking decisive victories rather than temporary tactical advantages. This was total war between species, and only one side would emerge with the evolutionary advantages necessary for long-term dominance. The discussion that followed revealed just how profoundly their recent experiences had changed their understanding of what humans were capable of achieving. Instead of focusing on immediate survival needs like food, water, and shelter, they were planning operations that spanned months and involved coordinated activities across multiple territories. They were thinking like a military organization rather than a desperate group of refugees. The wounded brother, despite his injuries, had become their most valuable strategic asset. His extended observation of serpent behavior had given him insights into predator psychology that no other human possessed. He understood how the intelligence network processed information, how tactical knowledge was distributed between different serpents, and most importantly, how the system could be systematically corrupted through carefully planned deception operations. His proposal was audacious beyond anything they had previously considered. Instead of simply defending against serpent attacks or conducting limited deception operations, they would attempt to establish permanent control over sections of the Predator Communication Network. By creating false information nodes that appeared to be legitimate serpent intelligence sources, they could systematically feed the entire network with tactical misinformation that would degrade predator effectiveness across enormous territories. The technical challenges were staggering. They would need to understand serpent chemical communication well enough to create convincing false signals. They would have to establish and maintain deception sites that could operate independently for extended periods. Most importantly, they would need to coordinate their activities with other human groups without alerting the serpent network to the existence of organized human intelligence operations. But the potential rewards were worth almost any risk. If successful, they could create safe corridors through dangerous territories, establish early warning systems that could protect multiple human communities, and potentially force the predator network to waste enormous resources chasing false information, rather than hunting actual human targets. They could transform the entire strategic situation from desperate defense to active intelligence warfare. The planning process revealed capabilities that surprised even the most experienced members of their group. The prolonged conflict with Titanoboa had forced them to develop analytical skills, strategic thinking, and coordination abilities that went far beyond anything their ancestors had possessed. They were becoming something new, a hybrid between primitive survival instincts and sophisticated tactical intelligence. The wounded brother outlined a three-phase plan that would gradually establish human intelligence superiority throughout the region. Phase 1 involved creating localized deception operations that would test their ability to corrupt small sections of the serpent network without triggering defensive responses. Phase 2 would expand these operations across multiple territories while establishing communication protocols with other human groups. Phase 3 would attempt coordinated network disruption on a scale that could permanently degrade predator intelligence effectiveness. Each phase carried escalating risks that could result in total annihilation if detected by the serpent network. But the alternative was accepting inevitable defeat in an intelligence arms race where the enemy was actively learning from every human innovation. They had reached a point where bold action was less dangerous than cautious inaction. The group began immediate preparations for Phase 1 operations, developing techniques for environmental manipulation that could create false serpent communication signals. They studied the chemical signatures left by Titanoboa during previous encounters, learning to recognize and potentially replicate the complex molecular information that serpents used for long-distance coordination. The technical complexity was mind-boggling for people working with Stone Age technology and materials. They had to become chemists, engineers, and intelligence analysts while maintaining the survival skills necessary to stay alive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Every innovation required them to push beyond the limits of what their species had previously achieved, but they had advantages that the serpent network couldn't match. Human imagination allowed them to conceive of deception strategies that had no precedent in natural predator behavior. Their capacity for abstract thinking enabled them to develop complex plans that could adapt to changing circumstances. Most importantly, their emotional intelligence gave them insights into predator psychology that purely instinct-driven analysis couldn't provide. And there you have it, the most incredible survival story in prehistoric history. Our early human ancestors didn't just survive against impossible odds. They revolutionized what it meant to be human. They proved that intelligence, cooperation, and sheer determination could triumph over the most perfect predators nature ever created. The swamp wars between humans and Titanoboa shaped the evolutionary path that led directly to us. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next week we're diving into even more mind-blowing prehistoric battles that will